When you hear the word antichrist, an image probably immediately appears in your mind. Perhaps an extremely powerful world leader, maybe a charismatic ruler capable of manipulating entire crowds, maybe someone who will appear in the last days to challenge God and deceive all of humanity. This image has become so common that it seems almost impossible to imagine any other interpretation. Movies, books, documentaries, and even many sermons have helped build this figure over the last few decades. But there is a problem that few people notice. When you open the Bible and carefully look for everything it actually says about the Antichrist, something unexpected happens. The figure that most people imagine begins to become less clear. Some of the most famous passages associated with the Antichrist do not even use that word. Others describe different characters, and some seem to speak about events that were already happening at the time they were written. This raises an extremely uncomfortable question. What if most of what we believe we know about the Antichrist does not come directly from the biblical text, but from interpretations built over the centuries? What if we are looking for a single man when the first Christians were trying to warn about something much greater? Before we talk about beasts, prophecies, mysterious numbers, and apocalyptic rulers, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to discover where the word Antichrist actually appears, because the answer may be very different from what almost everyone imagines, and that is exactly where the mystery begins. After all, if the Antichrist is one of the most famous figures in all of Christian eschatology, why does the Bible seem to say so little about him? And even more unsettling, what if we have been looking for the wrong person from the very beginning?
If you decide to do something simple and look for every time the word Antichrist appears in the Bible, you will probably be surprised, because it appears much less often than most people imagine. In fact, it is concentrated in only a few passages from the letters attributed to the Apostle John. And this is where the story begins to get strange, because John does not present the Antichrist in the way we normally see him in movies or popular interpretations. He does not talk about a great emperor ruling the planet. He does not describe a world ruler sitting on a throne, controlling all the nations of the earth. And he also does not immediately present a single figure destined to appear only at the end of time. Instead, John writes something that completely changes the direction of the conversation. He says, "Little children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have arisen." Stop for a moment and observe the force of this sentence. John mentions an Antichrist who would come, but immediately afterward he states that many Antichrists were already present, not one, many. This means that for the first Christians, the idea of the Antichrist was not necessarily limited to a single future person. It was already happening before their eyes. And this creates a fascinating question. Who were these Antichrists? Were they rulers, generals, priests, false prophets, or something even more difficult to identify? As we continue reading, John offers an important clue. He states that these individuals came from within the Christian community itself. They were not external enemies attacking the church from the outside in. On the contrary, they had been among the believers themselves. They knew Christian teachings, they spoke the same religious language, and precisely because of this, they were so dangerous. The problem was not merely open opposition to the message of Christ. The problem was distortion, imitation, the appearance of truth mixed with error. And perhaps this is exactly where one of the most disturbing interpretations of the Antichrist begins. Because if John is right, the greatest danger was never someone who was clearly evil. The greatest danger would be someone who appears to be on the same side, who speaks like a disciple, who presents himself as a defender of truth, but who gradually leads people in a completely different direction. And the further we go into this subject, the more we realize that the Antichrist may be far more complex than simply an apocalyptic villain waiting for his turn to appear in history. And when it seems that we have finally managed to understand the Antichrist, a second figure appears that has practically taken over the Christian imagination, the beast. This is where the number 666, the book of Revelation, political power, and that image of the great enemy of the last days that has crossed almost 2,000 years of history all come together. But there's a detail that completely changes this association. The book of Revelation does not call the beast the Antichrist. That word simply does not appear there. John describes a creature that emerges from the sea, receives authority, exercises power over peoples and nations, and is associated with an extremely enigmatic number, 666. And for centuries, people have tried to discover who might be hidden behind this number. Emperors, kings, religious leaders, and rulers were accused of being the beast. But there's a clue in the text itself that makes this investigation even more interesting. The author says that the one who has understanding should calculate the number of the beast because it is the number of a man. This suggests that the number could function as a code and not simply as a supernatural mark placed on someone's forehead. One of the most known historical interpretations connects 666 to the Emperor Nero through what is called gematria, a system in which letters have numerical values. When Nero's name is transliterated into Hebrew in a certain way, the sum can result in 666. This does not mean that this is the only possible interpretation, but it shows something extremely important. For the first readers of Revelation, the beast could have been understood in relation to events and figures from the world in which they themselves lived. And this, once again, changes our perspective. Perhaps the text is not simply handing us a photograph of the future. Perhaps it's using symbols to speak about power, persecution, idolatry, and political authority. The beast represents a system of power that demands what should belong only to God. It receives worship. It exercises authority. It controls economic life through the mark. And this is precisely where the number 666 becomes so powerful as a symbol. It is not merely a frightening number. It is a signature, an identification, a way of representing a human authority that exceeds its own limits and demands an almost religious loyalty. And now notice the problem. If the beast is not called the Antichrist in Revelation, then why did these characters end up being treated as if they were exactly the same figure? The answer lies in centuries of Christian interpretation, when different prophetic texts began to be read together, creating a single narrative about one great final enemy. And that is how the Antichrist, the beast, the man of lawlessness, and other figures began to merge in the popular imagination. But are they really the same person? Or are we putting together different pieces of a puzzle that was never originally designed to form a single image?
But there is still a figure that makes this whole story much more complex, because in one of the most enigmatic letters of the New Testament, there is someone who, for centuries, has been associated with the Antichrist, even though he is never given that name. Paul speaks of what he calls the man of lawlessness, or in some translations, the man of sin. And the description is disturbing. According to the letter to the Thessalonians, this character is connected to a period of great apostasy and places himself above everything that is called God or an object of worship, going so far as to present himself as if he were divine. Now notice the difference. John speaks of many antichrists. Revelation speaks of the beast. Paul speaks of the man of lawlessness. 3 different texts, 3 different characters, and originally they are not simply presented as a single person called Antichrist, but throughout Christian history, these images began to be placed side by side, and the more they were compared, the more they seemed to form a single enemy,
a final enemy, a powerful man, a leader capable of deceiving multitudes, someone who would appear before the end and directly confront what Christians consider sacred. But there is a detail in Paul's description that deserves much more attention. He says that there is something or someone preventing this character from being revealed at that moment. The text speaks of a force that holds him back, something that must be removed before the man of lawlessness is revealed. And this created one of the greatest debates in the history of Christian interpretation. Who or what is holding this character back? An empire? A political authority? A spiritual power? God himself. Paul does not fully explain, and perhaps this lack of explanation is precisely what made the text so powerful, because when a prophecy leaves a blank space, future generations inevitably try to fill it. Kings were identified as the man of lawlessness. Emperors were associated with the prophecy. Popes were accused of representing the final enemy. Modern rulers have also been given this title, and in different periods, completely different people have been pointed to as the Antichrist. This reveals something fascinating about the very nature of these prophecies. Perhaps they were written to inspire vigilance, but we transformed that vigilance into a search for names. We want to find a face. We want to point at someone and say, it's him. Because a face is much easier to understand than an idea. An enemy with a name, appearance, and address can be identified, but a system of thought, an ideology, or an authority that demands absolute loyalty is much harder to recognize. And perhaps that is exactly why the next part of the story is so important, because when we place John, Paul, and Revelation side by side, an even more unsettling possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the Antichrist is not simply a character. Perhaps it is a manifestation of something that can take different faces throughout history. And if that is correct, then the question stops being who will be the Antichrist and becomes how do we recognize that which acts against Christ when it appears before us?